Right. Hello. My name's Mark Rogers. I've been a developer with Alfresco now for 5 years, and today I'm going to talk about authentication and synchronization. I'm going to try and present a fairly broad introduction to authentication and synchronization rather than a narrow and complicated so I'm going to give a quick introduction to the configuration of authentication of Alfresco. I'm going to talk about authentication. I'm going to talk about synchronization. I'm then going to give lots of demos of the various stuff I've talked about, and I'm going to do that after I've done the talking, because in Barcelona I tried to intermix the two that I thought would be a good idea and actually ran out of time. And then at the end we'll have questions and I'll ask for questions. So, I know this is it's also worth mentioning that the slides for the presentation will be up on wherever they are, so you don't need to take notes, so you can read the slides. So anyway, when you're configuring Alfresco, it's absolutely crucial to know that there's lots of different ways of configuring Alfresco, and it's crucial to know that the precedence of where you configure various things. The most important thing is when you're setting an authentication setting, and I'll show examples. This is the first place you go to. It's a file called Alfresco global.properties, and any simple configuration, you put your changes in there. If you're using Alfresco community, then that's the place that you put your properties. For more complicated scenarios, so for example, if you're connecting to two LDAP servers that require different settings, then you can put your files in the extension subsystem. And I'm going to explain what these terms are as we go along. So you can have separate settings for each authentication subsystem. And finally, the top precedence is the administration interface. It's called JMX. It's only available in Alfresco Enterprise. But I'll be demoing the use of that later. And it's also worth mentioning that there is a new administration console in 4.2, which uses the JMX interface. So I'll demo 4.2's new features. The crucial point about this slide is that once you start using the admin console, then it will win over anything below this. So once you start using the admin console, then it will ignore these changes. So just a warning, it's important to understand that before we get started. So, and here in this example of the new 4.2 admin console, I'll demo it later, but I just wanted to give a quick show of it there. So anyway, let's start. So authentication is answering the question, who are you? May seem a bit obvious, and in an ideal world, a computer system, you just say, who are you? You'd say, I'm Fred, and that would be fine. Things get a bit more complicated in the real world because, whoops, come on. Not least that my things get a little more complicated in the real world because of this chap up here who would like to use your Alfresco system, and he will try and pretend to be you and get access to your data. So security has this reputation for being a little bit complicated because there's an arms race going on between the applications and the people that would like to misuse those applications. So in this slide, this is just showing a couple of people using Alfresco Share. You can also have other people using Alfresco and the bad people trying to hack into your system. So the first problem with security is the bad guys. The second issue for oops, oh come on. The second issue we have with Alfresco is that it has a lot of different interfaces. Now, these were just some I thought up while knocking up the slide in about 5 minutes. I could probably add a third column onto the onto this slide, but Alfresco has lots and lots of different interfaces, all of which will have slightly different security requirements. So, for example, FTP can do certain types of authentication. HTTP-based web applications can do certain types of authentication, and the list goes on. So mainly I'm going to be demoing with Alfresco Share, but it's important to think about the other interfaces as well. The first type of authentication is called Alfresco internal authentication, and for historical reasons this is known as Alfresco NTLM, which is a pretty bad name for it, but I'll show on the admin console when I come round to demoing it how this works. Alfresco internal authenticate. So when you add a user to Alfresco, it stores some credentials in this store here, which are used to authenticate our user, and so our user types in her name and a password, and the authentication subsystem says yes or no. All nice and easy. So when you create the user in Alfresco Share or Alfresco Explorer, that actually creates two nodes, and this is from the node browser. The first node it tries to create, it will create is a node of type person, and the person will have things like an email address and a name. So all users in Alfresco will have a person node. The second document that Alfresco will create when you create a user in Alfresco is called a user node, and this is what drives Alfresco internal authentication. The important things here are that it's got a couple of passwords which have been hashed, and in particular this is hashed by the MD4 algorithm, and this one is I think MD5 or something more complicated. So anyway, that's Alfresco internal authentication. Now, Alfresco wouldn't be terribly useful if that was all you gave, or if that was the only option. So Alfresco allows you to configure other authentication types. Um, so let us move on. So, this concept of a type of authenticator. So I've just been talking about the internal, otherwise known as Alfresco NTLM. You can also authenticate via LDAP, via pass-through, via external authentication, or via Kerberos. I'm just going to anticipate a couple of questions that are going to come up. The next authentication type to be added to Alfresco will probably be SAML. There is actually a SAML implementation in cloud, but it's not in 4.2 yet. But there is something existing. Anyway, so those four there should allow you to create quite a lot of different scenarios. So those are our different authentication types. And the second concept in Alfresco is there's something called an authentication chain. So the authentication chain, when a user wants to authenticate, it simply goes down the chain, trying the various authentication subsystems. A chain contains what's ordered, and it contains a type here and a name. If we're defining it in a properties file, it's simply a list of these: name, colon, type, comma, name, colon, type, comma, and that's how you build them up if you're actually editing in properties file. If you're using the admin console, then that's hidden from you, but it's just worth knowing that the authentication chain contains a list of authenticator name and type. So, pass-through authentication is the second type of on the list, and what that's going to do is our user tries to authenticate with an Alfresco repository, and that's going to talk with something called pass-through authentication is going to authenticate with your Windows domain, and it's going to do that by authenticating via something called a protocol called NTLM. Now, I've got a slide later on that explains about NTLM, but it's the idea behind NTLM is that it doesn't actually send the username and password over the network. What it does is it does some cryptographic stuff to stop you needing to send your password over the clear. It's worth me mentioning now that NTLM is it's a technology widely used in Windows, but it's about 15 or 20 years old now, and it's bordering on obsolete. So the advice from Microsoft at the moment is to not use NTLM and to use Kerberos instead. So that's pass-through authentication in 3 minutes. LDAP authentication. So an LDAP system is it stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. But the idea here is that organizations may have information structured about their organizations, and LDAP servers typically have user details in them. They may have group details, they may have systems, they may have email records, So any organisation that needs a directory of things, and LDAP is sort of the de facto standard for organisations having directories. So there is a variant of LDAP baked into Windows, and or you can get other versions for the Unix worlds. Anyway, so again, when we're using LDAP authentication, a user talks to Alfresco share, which talks to the repository, which will either it will take the user ID that's typed in and the password that's typed in and use that to authenticate, or there is an additional step here that you can map what's typed in here to the user ID used in the LDAP directory. That's just a regular expression, but no, it's not a regular expression. But sometimes F blogs here, well, it's a bad name for a lady, but F blogs there may actually be Fred blogs here. But this optional lookup just allows you to look up the F blogs to the Fred blogs, and then you authenticate. So I'll be demoing that in a little while. So that's our LDAP authentication in 3 minutes. External authentication is where the authentication is done by a system outside Alfresco, and in particular, people may use a system called CAS, or you may have your own application that's built in front of Alfresco. There's no need to use Alfresco through Alfresco Share. There's any number of applications out there. You may have your own username password table here. You may have your other application going off to your corporate credential store of some description. Anyway, external authentication, what that allows you to do is pass in, if we're talking HTTP, that allows you to pass in an HTTP header containing the identity of the remote user, and the repository will just accept that that remote user and treat that as an authenticated user. So there's a couple of caveats. That, of course, is a potential security hole. So it is it's fairly important that you've got a firewall in place to stop you being able to inject these tokens here. Anyway, that's external authentication in 3 minutes. And the granddaddy of security systems is Kerberos at the moment. And again, the idea behind Kerberos is that it doesn't actually pass your username and password details over the network. It works with tickets, and these tickets have a lifetime to live. And this is my attempt to draw a diagram of a Kerberos system. So, so our user comes in and says types in their username and password, and that authenticates with something called the Kerberos Key Distribution Center. And the other feature of Kerberos is that, as well as users being identified, the other applications are identified. So in particular, when we come to configure Kerberos, we need to give an account for Alfresco HTTP. And the other Kerberos user in Alfresco is Alfresco CIFS. So those two applications can use the ticket given by logging into this guy here, and then the service ticket. So that's a ticket for either, well, identifies the user and the service, and then you can access the repository. So it's a little bit complicated. It just works. It's also worth saying that Kerberos is baked into Windows now, and it is the recommended security security setting on Windows. It's not quite a vanilla Kerberos built into Windows, but it's good enough. There's details of Kerberos settings up in the Alfresco documentation as well. So if you look up in docs.alfresco.com, it's got quite detailed instructions about how you configure Kerberos. So that's authentication. Synchronization, as I was saying, LDAP contains directories of things, and in particular it contains directories of persons' details, and the most obvious one is the person's email address. So if you're, and why would you use a directory? Well, imagine you've got 50 applications in your organization. You don't want to have to go into those 50 organizations, adding users, adding their email addresses, changing their first names. So synchronization only works with LDAP. I don't see that as being a problem, because LDAP is used for directories. So again, synchronization, we're interested in this person's details. If you remember to the slide I showed in the internal authentication, so what synchronization is going to do is take the information here, and it's going to synchronize with the person node in Alfresco. So I started with an fblogs. It's going to synchronize details from fblogs. So what fields are synchronized? Out of the box, these are the properties in, well, in fact it's configurable via your Alfresco global properties, which field in LDAP these are configured as. But basically, out of the box, we can, I'm going to have to learn not to do that. We synchronize the username, first name, last name, email address, organization, or home folder provider. If you need to synchronize any other fields, then you can do, but you'll have to do a little bit of XML configuration. But I think using these the defined values will take you quite a long way. So synchronization is going to synchronize that. Do we need to go into the vagaries of NTLM? Let's just do it quickly. So as I was saying, NTLM authentication is still prevalent in Windows, although you shouldn't use it anymore. And the way it works is that when you log into Windows, you give it a domain name and a username. and it comes back and it gives a challenge, which is just a random number. You then send your, well, over on the client, there's some magic hash function. It's not magic, but there's a hash function that gets munges this challenge, username, domain name together, along with the it uses the user password as well in there. Yeah, it hashes with the password, sends a response to the server, who will either say yes or no. Some problems here. First is that we can't chain this challenge to many different servers. So you'll see settings to do, and NTLM v1 is not very secure. It uses something called an MD4 hash, which, as I said, is 15, 20 years out of date. Not very secure at all. So Microsoft, I think it was Microsoft, it could well be IBM, tried to make this more secure by, they changed the MD4 to MD5, and they also put the server name into this response. This makes authenticating via NTLM v2 tricky, because this is to stop a so-called man-in-the-middle attack, which of course is what Alfresco is attempting to be. So this causes problems for authentication. There is so this message actually knows that it's, so there is a trick, which is to run the domain server, the Windows domain server on this box, or use Kerberos, which is the Microsoft recommended. So more resources, but I think now I should move over to demoing stuff, because I've done my talking. So here I have an Alfresco server, and it's worth, I mentioned subsystems. So here my Alfresco server is started, but you'll find there is information about various subsystems starting. And the beauty about a subsystem is that you can configure it, reconfigure it. You don't need to take the entire server down. So if I change a value for a subsystem, it will shut down that subsystem and restart it. The rest of the server remains up and running. So that's why we use subsystems. So anyway, here is a running Alfresco, and for the other part of my demo, here is this is called this is an LDAP server. It's called Apache Directory Studio, and it's an open source LDAP server that I'm using as a source for the demo. So so in my testco organization, I've got various famous scientists. So that's the best company in the world, probably. And I've got a couple of groups. So come on. So my group physics contains Isaac Newton and Stephen Hawking. So that's a pretty good group as well. So anyway, this is my LDAP server, and Next thing I need to do, as I was mentioning in community, we need to configure things through property files. So it's not. So here's an example of setting the authentication chain via Alfresco. It's not terribly complicated. Just authentication.chain, name, type, name, type. We could also, in a simple example, have the various properties for the authenticator there. So that's the first place, and if we want to define any subsystem things, they will go in these folders here. So they will go in extensions, subsystems, authentication, LDAP, and then in this example I've got two called LDAP X and LDAP Y. So that's where you put your files. So if I just have a quick look in LDAP X, so that's just got the normal properties that I've just fiddled with this line in grey here. Anyway, so that's how you would configure community, or it's worth saying you can use the tools as well to work out the setting. Not everyone likes using the admin console in production, but you can use the tools to work out the settings that you then extract and stick in your property files, if that's the way you want it to work. So that's configuring through property files. Let's bring the browser up. And come on, bookmarks. Bookmarks. So this is 4.2 admin console. I'm aware that most of you may not have seen this before. But for the purposes of this demo, we're interested in the directory management. So this is where we configure our authentication and synchronization. So here we have our. This is the chain I prepared in the Barcelona. So here we have our authentication chain. So we've got an order. Again, it's got the name and the type, and we can add different instances by adding here. And we've also got some test options here. So let me just go in and show the NTLM. So this is the internal one. There's not a lot you can configure. So you can configure how to deal with guests and how to allow pass-through. Pass-through, there is a little more configuration here. The important things on this are whether you want to authenticate against your local server. In my example, I do, or whether you're going to try and authenticate another domain. The domain that you want to authenticate, and you can have a list of servers. So if you've got five domain servers you want to authenticate. You can also map a user in pass-through to be an administrator in Alfresco by adding the username here. So if you want fblogs to be an administrator in Alfresco, you put fblogs there. So So anyway, this system is configured and working. So let me just show control panel. Add and remove. So to demonstrate pass-through authentication, I've got a user up here called Bilbo. So he's a user on on this Windows domain. So now when I try and log into share, Bilbo so now Bilbo logged in. So that's an example of pass-through authentication. So now if we go back to so if I was to remove that authentication chain, oops, come on, and then so I've just shown changing the authentication chain online, so it's now no longer allowed in because I removed the pass-through authenticator. So if we go back to the directory management page, so that the next thing on the are the settings for LDAP. There's quite a few of them, but the most important one is this server here, this one here, which is how to connect to your LDAP server. Excuse me. And you can also have authentication and synchronization enabled. So why have we got these? You don't have to have authentication and synchronization. You could have just synchronization, or you could have just authentication. You can temporarily turn off synchronization by clicking this flag. Hopefully these fields here have descriptions. So right. So let me. Right, I think this is a working example. So let me just check it's working by so C. Darwin. This is Charles Darwin. Right. Okay. So I've just logged in as Charles Darwin just to show that I should. Excuse me again. So that was an example of LDAP authentication. So I've just logged in as this this user Charles Darwin. Let me. I'll leave that now. As well as the edit details, there's also a couple of tools here that will help you configure LDAP. The first one is a test synchronize. So there's an option here to just test whether your LDAP settings are correct. So you can type Darwin. That's not terribly exciting actually. That's just come up with a test passed in green, so that's good. But if I if I was to break something, so so if I mess up the port number, and then right. So I now get authentication messages. So this is just a tool to allow you to configure the authentication. So so here I see connecting to LDAP server 8999 failed. So that might give me a clue that the configuration is wrong. So I'm just going to fix it. The second tool that's been added on here is a test synchronize option. So this is to do with synchronize. If I press synchronize and run test, this is working fully. But it basically runs the queries that we've configured. So it's gone off and it's found some users and it's found some groups. Again, if I was to break the configuration, I'm running out of time now, but it would actually give you diagnostics, or it would at least tell you, if you're expecting groups and there are no groups to be there, you can think, there's a mistake in one of my queries here. Or it's worth saying this doesn't list all the groups; it just lists the first 10, because if you've got 50,000 people or something like that, or 1 million groups, you don't want to list 1 million groups. So that's the test synchronization. So that's the test synchronize. Useless fact of the day is that Charles Darwin, because he was so brainy, his people on the when he was doing his famous journey, his people on it called him Philos for some reason. That's Charles Darwin's nickname. So I've just in my LDAP server I've changed Charles Darwin to Philos. So now synchronization normally happens at midnight. So every midnight there's a synchronization run. Or alternatively, when someone tries to authenticate with a user that Alfresco doesn't know about, if it manages to authenticate via LDAP, then it will create a user in Alfresco, and it will also run synchronization then and there. You're allowed to. You can control that behaviour by flags. You can control most. So anyway, or the other thing that we can do is when we've changed LDAP, we just pop this button here that runs sync. So now, if I go onto my user dashboard and look up the profile, so here we can see that it's pulled out East Philos Darwin rather than Charles. Right, I think I've got. Have we got 4 minutes, or is it 5 minutes? So. I might be able to demo, but we've got 5 minutes for questions.
On community, is there anything that is available?
Sorry, can you talk to the microphone? So, so it's captured by the tape.
Sure.
Is it working? Yeah.
Is there, I'm using community, is there anything in community available through the global properties file that you can't get because you're not on the admin console in one?
No. The admin console gives you a little bit more status information, but you can configure, you can configure all the properties via global.properties and the subsystem files. So you can control all the behavior, but there is a little bit of reporting that you won't get that's enterprise specific. And the admin console is enterprise specific. I could have mentioned that it's a JMX interface, so let me just right. Sorry, I've connected to the wrong process. Yeah, I just wanted to show on the JMX there is a bit of summary information, so that's not available on Community, but all of the important stuff is there on Community. Okay.
You had mentioned that the admin console is on 4.2 Enterprise and that it overrides what's in the property files. If you use the admin console, it takes the settings in that. Does it actually edit the global properties files?
No, it doesn't. I should have also mentioned that on the way it's very clever. It's very clever, but the Spring reads reads properties from the attribute table first before falling back into the property files. So the reason I mention that is that if you're in a cluster, so again, if you're an enterprise and you're in a cluster and you change settings via the admin console, it goes across the cluster. So if you've got 5 nodes in your cluster, they all pick up that change. I should have mentioned that earlier. No, or and that behavior is controllable. So, for example, Alfresco's own cloud, they turn that behavior off. Or Spring is actually in charge of the configuration. So you could configure. You could actually go into Spring and clobber the admin console if you so desired. Okay.
One last question. Yeah.
Which kind of permissions does need the user of synchronization in Alfresco in the LDAP?
You mean which account is used?
Yeah, the sync user you use when in properties files.
It's got to be an account that can. Well, I could have demo. There's two authentications that happens. There's the authentication that's used for, if you remember on the slide I showed you, there's the account that's used for looking up the user, if you're using that, and that account is also used for synchronization. So the account you use for synchronization needs to have permissions to be able to list and look up users. But then the second authentication is actually the authenticate call, which is, can user Fred authenticate user Fred. So that is a lesser permission. Okay, I can. Okay. Another final question. Right, I'm aware that we have lunch now, so but I'll be around for the rest of the conference if you have questions.
Yep.
Anyway, let's try for the last
My
one.
question is, if we have already some 10 users in the system, we have already like NTLM authentication is there. Now I want to switch to LDAP, and those 10 users are already in our repository. If I switch to LDAP, those 10 users will be wiped off, or it will be, like if those 10 users are not in the LDAP, what will happen to those 10 users?
If they're not in LDAP, then they will continue to be
Because
in...
in my authentication chain, I removed the NTLM. I just kept the LDAP authentication.
Well, if you remove them from the authentication chain, then there's still the person node there, but they won't be able to authenticate.
So whenever I synchronize with the LDAP, it will not wipe off those users? It will keep those users
No.
in the repository? Or?
No, it won't wipe out users.
Okay.
It will only wipe out under the covers. There's something called a zone. So an LDAP server is one zone. It will only wipe out or delete users from that particular zone. So in the example where you had an authentication chain of Alfresco internal and LDAP, you remove the internal, the person node will still exist, the user node, which is used for authentication, will still exist, but you won't be able to authenticate because you've removed the Alfresco internal. There's another facet of that question, which is if you've got a user, Fred, authenticated via Alfresco internal, and you've also got a user, Fred, authenticated via LDAP, and then you change the order of the chain, then it works as you'd expect, but perhaps in that so if it was internal and then LDAP and you change it such that it's LDAP first, then it would authenticate Fred via LDAP first. So someone in Barcelona mentioned that he got the admin account and he'd done that, and it had flipped the admin account from internal to LDAP and confused things for a while because they'd got the admin user, i.e. as in admin, they'd got one in LDAP and one in internal. It works precisely as you'd expect, but it basically picks up the first one, but that's not what they expected. Okay, I think we're out of time, so thank you for listening to the bitter end. I'll be around in the rest of the conference if you've got any other questions, and perhaps I can demo personal stuff. Okay, thank you.